colloquially called dead cats, but this one has a life of its own. So, we've heard our passage. Well, I'm going to preach on the 2 Corinthians passage rather than the psalm, although there are obviously connections between the two. There's a lot in the passage that we have here in chapter 11, verses 16 to 23, and many different things that you can draw your attention to or you can be drawn out of it. And we've had a couple of examples of that this morning. So we've had reflections on the idea of weakness, because Paul says that if he is to boast, he will boast in his weakness. We've had, with the children's talk and the actual theme that's printed on the bulletin, some things about the sufferings that Paul went through, and I think it's momentary hardship, eternal glory was the theme on that entry slide. I'm not going to talk about either of those. I'm fascinated by the escape from Damascus at the end, but I'm not going to talk about that either. I'd love to sort of sit down with Paul and say, look, this letter needs some editing. You need to put that escape from Damascus into proper context and explain what it means and why you put it there. But that's another story. The thing that really has always struck me about this is the boasting. So I'm going to talk about boasting and a little bit about what it is why Paul boasts the way that he does, not so much the content of it, but why he's doing that. And then I'm going to switch tack a little bit to think about what is Paul doing here? Who is this directed at, or who is he defending himself from, and what that means to us here in our church now in the present day. So Paul probably uses the word boast or its derivatives more than anyone else in the Bible. If you look in a concordance under boast, it's all Paul's letters, and then there's a few other things elsewhere. But at the same time, we see that he's someone who appeared very reluctant to draw the attention to himself rather than to the gospel that he was preaching. And so it seems a bit extraordinary that he would really get carried away with boasting in the way in which he is and of talking about all those sorts of things. Now, to see what's going on, I think we need a reminder of where we are. So 2 Corinthians was written to that church which Paul had founded, and he wrote it. It's one of a series of letters that he wrote to the Corinthian church, of which we only have 2 currently in existence, although he alludes to others at various places. And it's written before he was planning his 3rd visit to that church. And there's a number of parts to it. The first 9 chapters are concerned with some of the details of the visit, including his change of plans as to why he was going to, I forget whether he made one long visit rather than 2 short visits, but there was a change of plans which was not accepted by some people. The details of the collection for the church in Jerusalem, which we thought about a few weeks ago, and also a number of doctrinal matters which Paul puts into most of his letters. And it also contains in those first 9 chapters some defences against criticisms labelled at Paul, particularly the idea that he's not a real apostle. Where we are now in the last 4 chapters, chapters 10 to 13, is actually developing that more fully into an argument for Paul's authority. I suppose not necessarily the authority of Paul, but the authority of his message of the gospel. And he's doing that in the face of people who are claiming to be more authentically apostles or sent ones or people who have authority or, that's a good enough word, within the church. And the reading today that we've got is right in the middle of it. And when you look at it, if you're trying to think about what's going on, it's really an argument that develops over several chapters, and pulling a slice out of it and is just a fragment of that. But I'm going to think a little bit more about the broader context of this. So in terms of what on earth is going on with this boasting, if we go back to the start, it says, "I repeat, let no one take me for a fool. But if you do, then receive me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting. In this self-confident boasting, I'm not talking as the Lord would, but as a fool. So Paul, I was going to say Paul makes it clear, but Paul never makes things very clear. But what he's saying is that when this is, I'm not talking as the Lord would. This is not Paul's natural way of talking in the way in which he would pass on the Lord's message, but instead he is talking as these other people would, as he describes as a fool. So he's basically, the boasting is a rhetorical device. And what he's doing is using the arguments of his opponents to show that their claims to be more truly apostolic than him are hollow claims. The boasting starts out with comparisons to the claims of the super apostles. And the translations of this talk about both false apostles and super apostles, and it's not really clear to anybody who he's talking about or what it was that they were actually trying to teach or do in the church, which was contrary to Paul's teaching. So it's a sort of a generic thing. There's a lot of speculation about what it might have been, but we don't know specifically who he was talking about or what they were doing. And so I'll probably swap between super apostle and false apostle, but we're talking about someone who claims to have the authority to stand in front of the church, pass on the message of God, but it's different from the message which Paul has presented to them and which they accepted when that church was founded. And so anything that they claim, he also has a right to claim. So, and even more so in most cases. So after being a Hebrew, an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, although we think of those as being similar things, they actually have different meanings. But Paul says, I'm just as much all of those things. I'm just as much part of the Jewish people. I'm just as much part of the heritage, the inheritor of the promise that was made to Abraham as any of you. But after that, Paul really goes to town with the sufferings and hardships that he has suffered as a servant of Christ. And we saw some examples of there. I got stoned, but there were lashings, shipwrecks, the stonings, the danger from all sides, hard work and sleeplessness, hunger and thirst and cold. And what's included in that list is actually much more than we have in the description of Paul's activity in Acts. For instance, it talks about having been shipwrecked 3 times, but this was before the final shipwreck, which is described in towards the end of Acts. So there was even more that's not in here and stuff in here that's not in Acts. So Paul really had a lot of things that he had to contend with. It's a very impressive list. So that's his boasting, saying, if you can boast, I can boast even more. But that's not what his message is. And he's saying that your claims to your authority based on those are false and meaningless because you're just not in the race. What Paul considers important can be seen if we look at verse 21, where he says, what anyone else dares to boast about, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast about. So that's wiped out. Paul can match those claims of the super apostles in any of the points they use. But in verse 30 then, and this is the bit where we come to weakness, it says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. So what matters to Paul in this when he is saying, believe me and believe the things I say, is do this on account of my weakness. Now this is again a difficult thing. Few of us would really consider Paul to be weak. What are Paul's weaknesses? Maureen told us some of hers. But can anybody think of a weakness that you would identify in Paul, in what you know of him, or of his character, his activities? His printing was really ordinary. We know that because he said so, that it was difficult to read. Peter said that his writing was sometimes difficult to understand, and I think it's true. He's not the most clearest writer that there's ever been. We don't know. We don't even know if it's a disability. That's I think for next week, the thorn in the flesh. But But it's really, what does he mean by weakness? So few of us really would consider Paul to be weak, but we think of that in human terms. He's not weak compared with other people. In fact, the things that he's told us here show us his enormous strength and resilience. But so who could we compare Paul with to show that he was actually weak? And of course the answer is with God. Now, I've said that Paul writes about boasting more than just about anybody else in the Bible. And one of the things that he was fond of saying, it's in chapter 10, just a short, of this book, just a short time before our current reading. And it's in other places as well, where it says, "Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." Now, this is usually taken to be an abbreviation of a passage in Jeremiah 9. And as I read this, you'll hear that Tony alluded to it in her reflection earlier. And it's worth looking at this. And it says this: "This is what the Lord says. Let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches. But let the one who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For in these I delight, declares the Lord." So what is important in judging the claims of the super apostles or the false apostles against those of Paul is this test. Do they know and understand God? Because that is what Paul, by reference back to Jeremiah, is saying is the thing that you should boast about. Not in your wisdom, not in your strength, not in your power, whatever it might be, but that you understand and know God. And that you know who God is as one who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness. In last week's passage, Paul expressed this as someone preaching a different Jesus or a different gospel. The Corinthians were impressed. Well, here we go. You shouldn't make generalizations about people, but enough of the Corinthians were impressed by the boasting of the false or super apostles about themselves, but were not discerning about the truth of the message that was being brought to them. In today's passage, Paul has gone on to argue that anyone can boast about their pedigree and accomplishments, but those are not the criteria by which they should be judged, or the criteria by which you judge the message which they bring or the things that they say. It is their weakness or their submission to God's will, their understanding and knowledge of God and his gospel, that is a true indicator of their status as an apostle, as Paul would say, or as anybody who stands up and, as I do here, to say anything about the word of God or to lead people or to teach people. So that's it. Does anybody disagree with me? No? So I could step down and end the sermon here because that's it. I think that's reasonably obvious. But at this point, it's rather abstract and distant that we're sort of talking about just trying to understand what it is that Paul is trying to say in this passage in the context of a church 2,000 years ago in what is now modern-day Greece as part of the Roman Empire. Now, I don't recall, and I like to sort of think about our day-to-day experience or the experience that we've had in this church or the things that we know about as something, a parallel for this or somewhere where we can apply this. But I can't think of anything in our little church where we might think that there have been what Paul might call super apostles or false apostles who have been boasting to us about how righteous they are or how eloquent they are or whatever it is, and leading us into some sort of false teaching. Has anybody got an example? No. So we don't need to worry about it. Doesn't apply to us. Well, there's actually, it does apply to us because the world is a very different place from those days, and one of the ways in which the world differs enormously is to do with the level of connectedness that we have with the rest of the world. Now, it's true in Paul's days that people could travel and write letters. Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church and he was going to travel to them. But the level of contact was fairly distant and fairly infrequent, and the volume of the contact and the information that people had was fairly small. That most of what people learnt about, and remember, this is in the days before there was, most of the books of the Bible had been written in their final form, before there was the New Testament scriptures had been gathered together. And most of what people knew or learnt about Jesus, about the gospel, his message, all those sorts of things, were done by word of mouth, by people that they saw face to face. But in our day, of course, we have ability to sort of see, hear, read anything from almost anywhere in the world. And we're subject to much greater range of influences in our thinking and in our practice than there were in those days. And you just need to go down to Coorong, have a look at the books on the shelves there, okay? There's a huge range of stuff there, all sorts of people saying all sorts of things, all claiming to be the messages of truth. There's a radio station that transmits from this building. You can see lots of things. Look on YouTube, what's on television. It's wherever you might want to be, on your favourite Christian social media or whatever. There are people who say and do things almost anywhere in the world that influence us. And we look to those people, rightly so, those who have thought about things. Jeff's looking very serious. I know that Jeff, for instance, was a fan of John Stott. Okay, but you can fill in the name with anybody else around the world who has written, said, broadcast, publicised things that influence the way that we do things. So we are potentially in a situation where we may be exposed to people who look bright and shiny, make claims about themselves, but may be presenting some version of the Christian faith which is at odds with what we would understand through a reading of the Bible. Now, I'm just going to talk about one example of this, and this may be contentious, and I want to say as I do this that I'm not actually trying to put any sort of judgment on this or any sort of definitive saying that these people are wrong, but merely to say that here is an area where there is debate about whether what they are saying is completely faithful to what the Bible says. And I'm going to pick on Brian Houston and Hillsong, and partly because they're originally New Zealand origin, but Australian, a local sort of thing, and also because there's a lot in the news. If you read there's an article in the Herald today which talks about a number of documentary series which are about to come out. There's an ongoing court case. There's all sorts of stuff going on. But I'm not going to talk about Brian Houston or any of the issues which he is facing, because that's a personal thing and that occurs in all sorts of churches and all sorts of situations. But I'm just going to talk about the broad Hillsong movement itself and the controversy around that, because it's an opportunity for it to see this is somewhere where we need to exercise some discernment and not to be looking at the boasting, as it might be, or the appearance of success or whatever it might be that church has. So the influence of the Hillsong Church on us here in this building is mostly through the music. So Hillsong has had a lot of very talented musicians over the years, and their music has been a very important and helpful part of our worship for decades now. But Hillsong is also an example of a very large, vibrant and growing church which attracts people to the gospel, and it's an aspirational model for church growth. And like most churches, its teaching is biblically based, and so is based on the truth. And if you have a look at their statement of faith, there's nothing there you disagree with. It's all really rock solid. All that stuff about the core teaching of justification by grace through faith as a result of the death of Jesus Christ. But there are also some problems which people have with some of the things they do, and the influence that that might have, both on people within the church, but also their influence on other churches. Now, our church has an Australian business number. We do that for tax purposes, but like almost every other church in Australia, it's unincorporated. It doesn't have legal status as a body. Hillsong does. It's called Hillsong Church Limited, and it has the legal status and structure of a business corporation, which is a very unusual thing. And although there's nothing in the statements of belief of Hillsong which promote a prosperity gospel, or the idea that it is desirable to become rich, or that it's one of those, the blessing of being a follower of Christ will be that you will become more wealthy, the actions of the church suggest that it has become too involved in making money and making feel good about being or becoming rich. Now, Brian Houston, who has had to step down from the leadership of the church recently, himself published a book in the year 2000, which was entitled, believe it or not, You Need More Money, Discovering God's Financial Plan for Your Life. And that's directed at people personally, but it's also, in some ways, people see that as part of the aspiration of the church as well, that it's a desire for making more money seems to be a part of the way in which they operate. Not surprisingly, the practices of Hillsong in relation to money have been widely criticised by Christians and churches of all flavours. So it's not something like you've got a left-right divide or an evangelical-liberal divide, whatever it might be, but it's something that makes a lot of commentators and right across the spectrum of the modern Christian church very uneasy. And the people sort of see that there seem to be inconsistencies with the very direct teaching of Jesus, of the prophets, of Paul, or the whole Bible, in fact, on poverty and wealth. And this seems to be one of the reasons behind the distancing of Hillsong from the broader Assemblies of God movement, or what is known in Australia as the Australian Christian churches. So Hillsong is no longer formally part of that, although they retain a loose association. And the defence of Hillsong is that if you have more money, then you're able to do more with it. You can do more evangelism, you can do more mission, you can do more charitable works, you can do more aid support, whatever it might be. And the response of the critics then is that this puts too much emphasis on the accumulation of resources rather than the message of the gospel, and also that a lot of what they provide with the money which they draw in is entertainment through what are effectively professional music performances, which are a part of their activities. So there's debate about that, but it's one of those things where people rightly question exactly what is going on. In verses 19 and 20 of today's reading, Paul says, "You gladly put up with fools since you are so wise. In fact, you even put up with anyone who enslaves you or exploits you or takes advantage of you or pushes himself forward or slaps you in the face." So basically, people in the Corinthian church are looking at people and saying, I'm really impressed with them because of the claims they make about themselves, the status, the position they put themselves in, but in doing so, I'm allowing them to do the wrong by me. And one of the debates that we've had in our church, it's sort of an ongoing debate, is whether we have been exploited by Hillsong when we use their music and contributing to a money-making venture which is at odds with our understanding of biblical teaching. Now, this is something where not everybody does agree on the answer to that, and it's something where nobody can, because there's no absolute in all of these sorts of things. We have different ways in which we approach life, different ways in which we approach ethics, and different flavours of interpretation of various teachings of the Bible on this. And so I don't want to say that what's going on is right or wrong, whether we should or shouldn't do things from here, but just to say this is an area of serious debate. And it provides an example of the things that Paul is warning about in this section of 2 Corinthians, but what he called super apostles, who are outwardly attractive because of the apparent success, but whose message strays from the truth. And we need to be discerning, not judging by worldly standards, but by asking hard questions about the gospel, whether the gospel is being taught faithfully. So that's just one example of how you can see a situation where the gospel could be at risk of being misrepresented by those who Paul refers to as false apostles or super apostles. And that's the adoption of a worldly corporate culture which measures success in material things. Now, in the church, we often think about the world's values and the church's values, or Christ's values, or whatever. And often when people think about worldly values, they think about in terms of personal things, often to do with sexual morality or greed, something like that. But in fact, if we're thinking about churches as organisations, I think the biggest risk to us in deviating from the teaching of the gospel is to adopt the sort of worldview, the corporate worldview, where our churches become business-like rather than Christ-like. And looking for our success is in the material things that we have, whether it's our money, our resources, our buildings, our scale of influence in the world, rather than the faithfulness of the message that we proclaim. And those worldly things tend to impress us. It's just part of our nature as human beings. But Paul boasts about his weakness and not his strength. And when we're looking for teaching or for role models, we need to look for those who, as Jeremiah says, can rightfully boast that they know and understand the Lord. Not about what they did, not about the bright shiny things, not about the sort of the scale or whatever it is, but that we know and understand the Lord, and this is what we know and understand. There are, of course, other sorts of risks in the sort of the super apostle type of thing that I don't have time to look at. But perhaps the most obvious one that interests me but is not very relevant to us right at the moment is the influence of far-right politics in the evangelical church, and the politics that are based on self-interest. And there's a lot of, we'll see that again as the American election, next American presidential election comes up. It's a very vexing problem for churches in America, but it's less of a problem here because we're a less polarised society. But there are people who we look to as people who have messages that we take in whatever way, who are actually, if you look hard, they're associating themselves with a politics which is based very much on self-interest and is very contrary to the message of the Bible, in which we place the interests of others first and don't reflect on ourselves, but look outwards and upwards. So as individuals in a church, we're exposed to messages from outside who bring what we could call an apostolic message. They could be authors, they could be preachers, they could be YouTubers, they could be musicians or whatever. Most of them have a worthwhile message to bring, and we can get a lot from them. And I've picked on Hillsong, but the Hillsong songs in general are great. And certainly can be a very valuable part of worship. But we need to exercise judgment, and we also need to be careful about the other things that might be packaged in with the good things, and make sure that we're not led astray when they also teach or practice things which are contrary to the message of the Bible or the character of the God. And I'd just like to sort of finish off by reminding you of the character of God as Jeremiah said it in chapter 9, as I read before. I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these I delight. And I think in our practices and the way in which we do things, that is the model that we should also be able to say that we, as individuals in the church, exercise kindness, justice, and righteousness, and that we delight in those.